If you begin to think differently, even in small ways, you may start to notice something shift. Not suddenly, but gradually. The way you respond to situations, the way you interpret what happens, and the way you move through your day. Because your thoughts are not just reactions, they are directions. And when those directions begin to change, your experience begins to follow. Most people are not aware of this. They assume that life is something happening to them, that circumstances determine how they feel, how they act, and what results they experience. But if you look more closely, you begin to notice something else. Between what happens and how you respond, there is a space. And in that space, there is a pattern of thought, a way of interpreting what is happening. And that interpretation quietly shapes everything that follows. If your thoughts lean toward doubt, your actions begin to reflect hesitation. If your thoughts expect difficulty, your behavior adjusts accordingly. You may delay. You may overthink. You may pull back before fully engaging. Not because you are incapable, but because your internal direction is unclear. And when direction is unclear, movement becomes inconsistent. But when your thoughts begin to support direction, even in subtle ways, something begins to change. You begin to respond differently. You begin to stay engaged longer. You begin to follow through, instead of stopping early. And over time, that difference becomes significant, because your results are not separate from your thinking. They are shaped by it, not in one moment, but through repetition, through what you return to, again and again, until it becomes familiar, until it becomes natural, until it begins to guide your behavior automatically. And as this continues, you begin to notice something else. Your reactions become more stable. Your decisions become clearer. You begin to move forward with less resistance. Not because everything around you has changed, but because the way you are engaging with it has. And that shift, even though it feels subtle at first, creates a new pattern. A pattern where you remain involved. A pattern where you continue instead of stopping. A pattern where your thinking supports your movement, instead of interrupting it. So instead of asking, how do I change everything at once? A better question becomes, what direction are my thoughts moving me in right now? Because that direction, repeated consistently, becomes your experience. And once you begin to see that clearly, you realize something important. Change is not something you wait for. It is something you are already creating. The only question is, are you guiding it or repeating it? If your thoughts are directions, then the next step becomes clear. You begin to choose them more intentionally. Not every thought, but the ones you return to most often, because those are the ones that shape your experience. This does not mean forcing yourself to think in extremes. It does not mean repeating something you don't believe. It means choosing thoughts that allow movement, thoughts that support progress, thoughts that create stability. For example, when you think about something you want, notice your first reaction. Is it hesitation? Is it uncertainty? Does your mind immediately begin to question it? If so, that pattern has likely been repeated many times. And because it has been repeated, it feels familiar. But familiar does not mean accurate. It simply means practiced. So instead of reinforcing that reaction, you begin to introduce something different, something more supportive. Instead of thinking, I'm not sure this will work, you begin to think, this is something I can move toward. Instead of asking, what if this fails? You begin to shift toward, how would I approach this if it worked? These are not dramatic changes. They are subtle, but they are powerful, because they are repeatable. And what is repeatable becomes consistent. And what becomes consistent begins to feel natural. You can apply this throughout your day, in small moments. When something takes longer than expected, instead of assuming delay means failure, you begin to think, this is part of the process. When something doesn't go as planned, instead of reacting with frustration, you begin to think, I'll adjust and continue. Not because everything is perfect, but because this way of thinking allows you to stay engaged. And staying engaged is what creates results. Over time, these thoughts begin to replace older patterns. Not by force, but through repetition. You return to them, again and again, until they begin to feel familiar. And once they feel familiar, they begin to guide your behavior automatically. And as your behavior becomes more consistent, your results begin to follow. Not instantly, but steadily. Because direction, when maintained over time, always leads somewhere. The question is, are your thoughts leading you forward or keeping you where you are? As your thinking begins to shift, another layer becomes easier to notice. Expectation, not what you say you want, but what you assume will happen. Because expectation quietly shapes attention, you begin to notice what aligns with it and overlook what is not. And over time, this creates a pattern, not because reality is fixed, but because your focus is. If you expect difficulty, you begin to notice resistance more quickly. If you expect delay, you interpret situations through that lens. And those interpretations shape how you respond. But if you begin to shift expectation, even slightly, something else begins to happen. You begin to notice possibility. You begin to stay engaged longer. You begin to respond with more intention. Instead of thinking, this probably won't work, you begin to think, there are ways this could work. And that shift begins to influence your behavior. You take small steps. You stay involved. You continue. And those actions begin to create results. Not instantly, but consistently. Because expectation shapes direction. And direction, over time, shapes outcome. Pause. At the same time, your emotional response begins to change. Not because you are forcing it, but because your thinking is different. You begin to feel more stable, less reactive, more focused. Situations that once caused hesitation no longer affect you in the same way. You recover faster. You think more clearly. You continue more easily. And that emotional stability supports your actions, because when your internal state is steady, your behavior becomes consistent. And consistency, over time, creates results. Pause. So instead of asking, what will happen? You begin to ask, what am I expecting to happen? Because that expectation quietly guides everything that follows. And once you begin to direct it, you begin to notice that your experience is not random. It is responding to the patterns you repeat. Once expectation begins to shift, you can take it one step further. You begin to think, as if things are already in motion, not completed, but unfolding. Because many people try to believe in an outcome that feels too far away. And when it feels unrealistic, they stop. But instead of forcing certainty, you begin to adopt direction. You begin to think, this is already progressing, even if you cannot see it yet, even if it is not obvious. Because this way of thinking changes how you respond. Instead of waiting, you begin to act. Instead of doubting, you begin to explore. Instead of stopping, you continue. And that continuation creates momentum. Pause. You can apply this in simple ways. When you think about your goals, instead of questioning them, you begin to approach them differently. You think, this is something that is already developing. And from that perspective, your actions begin to align. You begin to follow through more easily. You begin to stay consistent. You begin to trust the process, instead of resisting it, not blindly, but intentionally, because thinking as if something is in motion keeps you engaged. And engagement is what produces results. Pause. Over time, this becomes natural. You no longer need to remind yourself. You begin to think this way automatically. And once that happens, your decisions become easier. Your actions become more consistent. And your direction becomes clearer. Because you are no longer waiting for certainty. You are creating it through the way you think and the way you continue. And that shift quietly builds momentum. Not all at once, but in a way that becomes undeniable over time. Because what you treat as in progress, you stay committed to. And what you stay committed to eventually begins to take shape. And that is where change becomes real. As this way of thinking continues, another shift begins to take place. The way you perceive possibility. Some people approach life from limitation. They assume there isn't enough time, enough opportunity, or enough ability. And when you think this way, your actions reflect it. You hesitate. You hold back. You delay. Not because you have to, but because it feels consistent. But when you begin to think differently, you begin to approach things from possibility. Not unlimited certainty, but open direction. You begin to think, there are ways forward. And that thought alone changes how you respond. You begin to take small steps. You begin to stay engaged. You begin to continue, even when things are unclear. And over time, those small actions begin to build. Not dramatically, but steadily, because possibility creates movement, and movement creates results. Pause. As this continues, you begin to notice something else. You stop focusing on what is missing, and you begin to focus on what is available, what you can do, what you can try, what you can move toward. And that shift in focus changes your experience. Because attention directs energy, and energy, directed consistently, produces change. Not instantly, but inevitably. And once you begin to see that, you realize something important. You don't need perfect conditions. You need continued direction. And that direction begins with how you choose to think. As your thinking continues to evolve, something deeper begins to shift. The way you see yourself. Because underneath repeated thoughts, there is identity, a quiet assumption about who you are and what you are capable of. And most of the time, this identity is not chosen consciously. It is formed through repetition, through what you have told yourself, again and again. And once that identity feels familiar, your behavior begins to align with it, automatically. If you see yourself as someone who hesitates, you delay. If you see yourself as someone who struggles, you expect difficulty, not because you are limited, but because it feels consistent. But if you begin to shift that identity, even slightly, your actions begin to change. Instead of thinking, I hope this works, you begin to think, I follow through. Instead of, I'm not sure I can do this, you begin to shift toward, I'm learning how to handle this. These changes are subtle, but they are powerful, because over time, they begin to feel natural. And once they feel natural, they begin to guide everything you do. Without force, without pressure, you simply begin to act in ways that are consistent with who you believe you are becoming. Pause. And as this continues, you begin to notice something else. You trust yourself more. You move more decisively. You stay engaged longer. Because your actions are no longer fighting your identity. They are aligned with it. And when alignment happens, progress becomes consistent. Not because everything is easy, but because you continue. And that continuation quietly changes everything. As these patterns are repeated, they begin to settle into something deeper. Not just conscious thinking, but automatic response. The subconscious. This is where repetition becomes powerful. Not because you are trying to convince yourself, but because you are creating familiarity. What you return to consistently becomes easier to believe. And what becomes easier to believe begins to feel natural. So instead of trying to change everything at once, you focus on returning, again and again, to thoughts that support direction. In simple moments, throughout the day, when something feels uncertain, you don't follow the first reaction automatically. You pause, and you choose something more useful. You think, this is something I can handle. Or, I'll figure this out step by step. These are not dramatic thoughts. They are stable ones. And stability creates consistency. Pause. Over time, this becomes automatic. You no longer need to remind yourself. You begin to respond differently, without effort, because what was once intentional has now become familiar. And what becomes familiar begins to guide everything you do. And when your responses change, your results begin to change as well. Not instantly, but through repetition, because repetition is what turns direction into reality. At this point, the process becomes something you can apply, not in theory, but in everyday life, because this is not something reserved for big moments. It works in the small decisions, the quiet reactions, the way you interpret what happens throughout the day. When you wake up, notice your first thoughts. Are they rushed? Are they reactive? Or are they intentional? You can begin to shift them, even slightly, by directing your focus. Instead of thinking about everything at once, you begin to think, what is the next step I can take? During the day, when something doesn't go as planned, instead of reacting automatically, you pause, and you think, I'll adjust and continue. Again, not forcing positivity, but choosing direction. Because direction, repeated consistently, becomes habit, and habit becomes identity. Pause. Even in conversations, you may notice patterns. Do you hold back? Do you assume outcomes before they happen? Or do you begin to approach interactions differently? With more presence, more clarity, more intention. These shifts are subtle, but they accumulate. And as they accumulate, your experience begins to change. Not all at once, but steadily, because you are no longer reacting automatically. You are responding intentionally. And that difference, over time, becomes visible in your actions, in your confidence, and in the results that follow. As you continue applying this, you may notice something else. Resistance, not from the outside, but from within. Thoughts that question the process. Doubt that appears, even as you begin to shift. This is normal, because your mind is used to familiar patterns. And anything unfamiliar can feel uncertain at first. You may begin to think, this won't last, or this feels forced, or even, this isn't working. But these thoughts are not signals to stop. They are reflections of what has been repeated before. And this is where consistency becomes important. Not perfection, but persistence. Instead of reacting to doubt, you begin to observe it, you notice it, without immediately accepting it. And then, you return to the direction you've chosen. Even if it feels subtle, even if it feels slow. Because change does not always feel dramatic. It often feels quiet, gradual, almost unnoticeable at first. Pause. But over time, those small returns begin to weaken old patterns and strengthen new ones, until what once felt unfamiliar begins to feel natural, and what once felt automatic begins to fade. This is the part most people miss. They stop too early, not because it isn't working, but because it doesn't feel immediate. But if you continue, even in small ways, the shift continues as well. As these shifts continue, something begins to build. Momentum, not in a dramatic way, but in a steady progression. Because when your thoughts change, your actions begin to follow. And when your actions change, even slightly, your results begin to shift as well. At first, these changes may be small. A decision made more quickly. A hesitation that doesn't last as long. An idea that you would have ignored, now being explored. These moments may seem insignificant, but they are not, because they accumulate. And as they accumulate, your experience begins to reflect them. Not all at once, but in a way that becomes noticeable over time. You begin to see that progress is happening, even if it is subtle. And that realization creates something important. Confidence. Not forced confidence, but the kind that develops through evidence, through repeated experience, through seeing that your actions are producing results. Pause. At this point, the process becomes clear. Your thoughts are not random. They are patterns, and those patterns, when repeated, shape your experience. So instead of asking, how do I change everything? You begin to ask, what am I reinforcing every day? Because that answer reveals direction, and direction, over time, becomes outcome. So as you move forward, notice your thoughts. Choose what you return to, again and again, because what you return to becomes familiar. And what becomes familiar begins to guide your life, quietly, consistently, until one day, you begin to notice something different. Not because everything changed at once, but because your direction did. And that direction, given enough time, becomes your reality.